He was the face of an era, the sound of American ambition translated into luxury and power. Sean "Diddy" Combs didn't just sell music, he sold an idea of absolute dominance. From Queens to Beverly Hills, his name became synonymous with a staggering ascent, as if the American dream itself had donned a bespoke suit and learned to rhyme. He personified success in its most brilliant form, yet carried the essence of its darkest consequence. A man who seemed to have cracked the code of reality, operating under rules only he understood. With every public appearance, he radiated something that oscillated between magnetic charisma and total control, as if everyone around him were satellites forced into orbit at his unique frequency. But the dazzling brightness of a star is also the perfect disguise for an inevitable eclipse. For years, the Bad Boy Records empire was worshipped as an inexhaustible hit factory. But backstage, there were sounds few in the industry dared to decipher. These were whispers of private parties that spiraled out of control, secrets guarded by ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and heavy silences that were bought, not earned. The music industry, with its long history, has always loved its self-proclaimed gods, and has always been complicit in closing its eyes to the sacrifices demanded at its altar. Diddy did not merely establish a record label, he erected a throne of raw power. And revolving around this throne was a complex court, sustained by a volatile mix of fanatical loyalty, deep-seated fear, and blind adoration. By the mid-90s, as hip-hop transitioned into billionaire status, he positioned himself as the sole conductor of the entire orchestra. Every colossal hit made him more untouchable, more distant from conventional norms. There was something almost religious, perhaps even occult, about his presence, something that surpassed the simple figure of an entertainment executive. He appeared to have struck an invisible pact with the system itself, a tacit agreement that his empire would never be truly challenged. The legendary parties, the ever-present private jets, the mansions adorned with marble and endless mirrors, all were symbols of a power that indeed never slept. However, those who never sleep never dream of the truth, and the man who set out to control. Everything began to be slowly controlled by the distorted reflection of his own unchecked power. When the first serious allegations began to surface, incredulity was the initial reaction. It was unthinkable to the public that someone so deeply entrenched in the upper echelons of Hollywood, so celebrated by presidents and global stars, could harbor something so fundamentally dark. But as physics teaches us, the most intense lights always project the deepest shadows. The most intense lights always project the deepest shadows. In November 2023, the artist Cassie Ventura, his former girlfriend and protege on his label, broke what appeared to be the final pact of silence. The civil lawsuit she filed seemed, at first glance, like just another multi-million-dollar celebrity dispute. But the cold, stark lines of the legal document contained a story of psychological and physical terror that the world, accustomed to Diddy's glamour, was completely unprepared to hear or absorb. Cassie detailed years of obsessive psychological control, recurring physical assaults, and calculated, constant emotional manipulation. She spoke of nights that began with the euphoria of music and fame, yet invariably ended in profound terror and raw fear. What was marketed to the world as luxury was, for her, a harrowing psychological captivity. She recounted hidden cameras strategically placed in private spaces, veiled threats, and a routine where total submission was the only permissible law. The formal accusation was shocking, but the extremely swift financial settlement, sealed in less than 24 hours after filing, left something profoundly unsettling in the air. A heavy, deafening silence, as if the truth had been forcibly sold and silenced rather than fully told. Nevertheless, the myth's spell began to break irreversibly, and Diddy's empire, once impenetrable and shielded by mountains of cash and years of political influence, began to show deep structural cracks that could no longer be ignored, even by the most protective media outlets. In the cold, opulent corridors of the industry, new voices emerged. They were loyal former employees, trusted security guards, models, and assistants. Their stories differed in detail but shared identical patterns of abuse, systematic coercion, parties that seemed endless, and invitations that, in reality, no one had the freedom to refuse. The federal prosecution then took over the case and began a meticulously planned criminal investigation. What initially appeared to be just another celebrity scandal rapidly escalated into a serious, high-stakes federal criminal case. And behind the sensational headlines, an older, more mysterious plot unfolded. That cautionary tale where absolute success, when acquired disproportionately, demands something in return that transcends mere money. The soul. In September 2024, the world witnessed the impossible. Sean Combs was arrested in a federal operation that, to some, possessed the precision and coldness of an exorcism, rather than the simple bureaucracy of a judicial warrant. Sean Combs' arrest in September 2024 tolled like a death knell for show business, accused of sex trafficking, criminal conspiracy, and transportation to engage in prostitution. The mogul who had once defied the laws of music was now forced to confront the laws of man. His downfall was broadcast as an inverse spectacle. The man who always lived under the world's spotlights was now being swallowed by the very darkness they cast. To outside observers, it seemed like the inevitable arrival of justice. To those watching closely, it felt like the harbinger of a collapse that appeared deeply spiritual. Federal prosecutors meticulously detailed the constant use of his private jets to transport women across state lines and even international borders, always to isolated, private events where the uncontrolled consumption of alcohol and heavy drugs was the sole rule. They privately dubbed these gatherings freak-offs. The term sounded vulgar and trivial, until witnesses described what truly transpired. Long, deeply coercive encounters, with graphic records of violence and humiliation. Cassie had previously warned about this sinister pattern, but now the reports multiplied exponentially. The evidence presented included encrypted text messages, surveillance videos, and detailed flight itineraries. But what was most shocking wasn't the simple evidence of the crime. It was the profound sense that none of this was new, only finally revealed to the public. During the preliminary hearing, the defense attorneys desperately attempted to turn the case into a media spectacle of distraction. They spoke of extortion, envy, and a vast media conspiracy aimed at tearing down a black icon. But the most brutal pieces of evidence resisted every legal maneuver. The shocking 2016 video showed Diddy physically assaulting Cassie in a hotel hallway. The images spoke for themselves. Yet what many observers felt was the presence of something invisible and uncatalogued in that courtroom, an oppressive presence, an atmospheric weight, an almost physical field of energy that emanated from the defendant. Certain renowned journalists reported sudden malaise, inexplicable failures in their recording equipment, and cameras that shut down spontaneously at crucial moments. Others claimed that upon hearing Sean Combs' full name pronounced by the prosecution, the air in the room seemed to shift in density, becoming heavy and cold. The case clearly began to transcend the exclusive domain of criminal law. It became a terrifying cultural mirror. The ultimate symbol of wealth and ostentation was now the portrait of an entire era's moral decay. The man who taught the world to associate wealth with glory now personified the corruption of the soul itself. The man who taught the world to associate wealth with glory now personified the corruption of the soul. The federal prosecution, in a strategic and almost mystical move, evoked the Mann Act of 1910, legal relic created at the turn of the century, to punish the transportation of individuals across state lines for immoral sexual practices. It was almost poetic, or perhaps predestined, that a hyper-connected modern man would be struck down by a century-old law, as if the past was finally collecting a long-forgotten debt. The historic trial was scheduled for May, in the austere federal courthouse of the Southern District of Manhattan. The press was categorically banned from recording any images. No video, no photos of the mogul, only official transcripts and the accounts of the few authorized individuals present in the room. Cassie, the key witness, took the stand with a trembling yet firm voice. She stated under oath that she sought not revenge, but merely her liberation. Her testimony described not only years of physical and mental abuse, but also sensations that sent shivers through the silent jury. A persistent smell of sulfur in certain rooms, lights that inexplicably flickered, and terrifying moments when Diddy seemed to transform into someone else, utterly devoid of humanity. The defense attorneys, of course, laughed openly at the supernatural allegations, seeking to disqualify the witness as hysterical. But those who watched the scene described a strange, almost liturgical silence that settled over the room. It seemed that something was reacting violently to those very words. As the hearings advanced toward their climax, new, previously protected names emerged: other artists, prominent producers, personal security staff, Some confirmed the darkest details, while others mysteriously vanished from all social media platforms and public contact. The investigation spiraled into a labyrinth of conspiracy and fear. At the center of it all, the same question persisted, more urgent than ever. What exactly sustained such absolute power for so long? Money explains most of it. Fear explains the rest. But there was a layer of mystery no one dared to name, and it was precisely this layer that was forcibly beginning to reveal itself in the courtroom. The pressure on the jury was immense. They had to decide if Diddy was merely a lavish participant in vice or the calculated maestro of a federal criminal enterprise. The pressure on the jury in the heart of Manhattan was immense. In July 2025, the verdict was announced in a climax that shattered the tension. Sean Diddy Combs was acquitted of the most severe charges of sex trafficking and criminal conspiracy. The room remained in petrified silence. It was as if everyone intuitively knew that the full, integrated truth of the story could not be contained. Within the pages of the legal brief, the jury found him guilty, however, of just 2 violations of the Mann Act, the crime of transportation to engage in prostitution, a lesser penalty to be sure, but one sufficient to indelibly and permanently stain the name that once symbolized unquestionable power. He managed to evade the specter of life in prison that hung over him. But he did not escape the world's moral judgment. The man who taught the world to crave luxury above all else was now a prisoner of the price of that very luxury. The judge subsequently sentenced him to 4 years and 2 months in federal prison, plus 5 years of strict supervised release. Upon hearing the final sentence, Diddy maintained a fixed, empty gaze, showing no discernible emotion. The prosecution had requested the maximum allowed by law. The defense pleaded for clemency. The judge was unyielding, stating only with a heavy voice, "No empire rises without paying its price." The words echoed. Cassie visibly wept in silence, and for a brief moment, the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. The bad boy empire, which once absolutely dominated pop culture, was collapsing before the world's eyes. But the true, spiritual collapse was happening elsewhere, deep within the mogul's soul. In his final public statement before being transferred, he asked for forgiveness. He claimed to be ashamed and seeking redemption, but his voice sounded strangely distant, as if speaking through another presence entirely. The public heard him, but few, in fact, believed his sincerity. The spectacle was ending, but the heavy, lingering sense of incompleteness persisted. The heavy sense of incompleteness persisted, hanging over the case like a black cloud. In federal prison, reports from guards and inmates began to circulate in secret, far from the spotlight. They claimed Diddy spent nights wide awake, muttering to himself, filling notebooks with nonsensical phrases, that he requested the cell lights be kept on at all times, revealing a desperate aversion to the darkness, that he had a palpable fear of shadows. Some asserted that on certain early mornings, the entire wing's electrical system would fail only around his cell. Others claimed to have heard screams in languages they did not recognize. None of this was officially confirmed. But the rumor, the element of mystery, grew. The man who mastered the industry was now fighting against what was left when the music finally stopped playing. This was not merely a legal case. It was the violent conclusion of a cultural cycle of profound excess, the final collapse of an era where unlimited power and impunity were celebrated almost as virtues. The shiny mask of success had fallen, utterly destroyed by the weight of reality. And what was revealed behind it was not a monster, but something even more terrifying. There was a void. In the dark underbelly of fame, all glory has a fixed price. And sometimes that ultimate price is not paid in money, which is fleeting, but rather in the soul. The Diddy case, in its totality, does not conclude with the jury's verdict, because that verdict is only the surface of what human justice can reach. The true reckoning happens in silence, when there are no cameras left to film and no voices left to defend. Now, behind concrete and steel, the man who once commanded lights and crowds faces only the pulse of his own breath. The empire he built echoes faintly, like a rhythm still trapped inside his mind. Somewhere between guilt and surrender, he begins to understand that what he served was never fame. It was hunger itself. And hunger never forgets. The lights of the cell flicker once, then steady. A guard walks past without looking in. Outside, rain taps the window like a metronome marking time. Somewhere far beyond the noise of the world, a question endures, quiet, ancient, merciless. When the king finally falls, does the crown die with him, or simply wait for another head?